Hey, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I am pleased to welcome you to our Microsoft Teams Security Best Practices Summit, brought to you by CoreView and 8x8. Before we start today's event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know it's being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's 3 sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's 3rd session, we'll be giving away a Surface Pro 8, but you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors, CoreView and 8x8, available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of our sponsors underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit, so we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Top Security Threats with Microsoft Teams. This session features Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO at Cyjax. Ian is an ITIL certified professional with 25 years of experience in IT and security. He has served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch, having joined the CF Military Police Reserves and retiring as a public affairs officer. After a year with the RCMP as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst/consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare. Ian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, David, and it's always delightful. I'm really actually kind of bemused a little bit at this particular presentation because at first I really thought about Teams and I was like, I don't know. So like what you do when you're trying to get ideas and you're trying to sort of prove things and sort things out, you sort of go to some of your friends, and I'd like to personally thank Mike, AppSecBloke on Twitter, for helping me debunk and take a look at Teams a little bit deeper, and then just kind of help us figure out, where we can go with this particular presentation and webinar. So that's kind of my bio slide. Great picture of me in the Cayman Islands when I was there for a conference on cryptocurrencies and the metaverse. But I do work for a cyber threat intelligence company, also CTO for a managed service provider here in Canada, where I currently am. And of course, big fan of the Beer Farmers online. So I'm not a fan of Teams. Got to be honest with you. However, okay, I'm not going to end the presentation at that and then peace out. But we are going to get in a little bit under the hood on here, and I will explain to you, particularly in my particular case, why I'm not a fan. Now, I am on the Apple platform, and I think, to be fair, Teams has been built more leaning towards the whole Active Directory, Office 365 ecosystem, Microsoft Edge browser. We'll talk about why that becomes a factor, and Microsoft Defender platform. Okay, now, I have none of those running on Apple, so I would suggest that maybe not deliberately, but certainly there are functionalities and integrations that are not nearly as slick as they would be on the Windows platform. So I get this a lot when you open a Teams link, right? And it says, you have a couple of options here, sir. And your option is to open this link with your Teams app that you've got installed, potentially open the Teams link within the browser, which, if you're a Chrome user, you may agree with me, can be deeply problematic, and we'll talk about why that is such a struggle as well in this presentation, and it does sort of rapidly build the case for perhaps using a third party for some of your needs, and we'll talk about where I think that market is. And then also download the Mac app, which again can be problematic if you don't have the necessary rights to install that particular software. So if your rights are restricted, the download and install the Mac app is not really an option for you without those elevated privileges. And so we end up with having to make the choice of really none of the above. And there's a few use cases that we're going to talk about today that end up quickly using a free Zoom account or some other collaboration application to actually have the face-to-face conversations that we're so used to having in the post-pandemic and then, of course, during the pandemic world. So when I got into this and just sort of started to frame this out, I sort of wanted to talk about like the free ecosystem, but not free as in free beer ecosystem of Microsoft, right? The proclamation that Teams is, part of Microsoft 365. This has particular nuances and problems of its own that we'll certainly get into. Its integration with OneDrive and SharePoint, and to be honest, my experiences with SharePoint are somewhat akin to my experiences with on-premise Exchange. It has never really met my expectations at all. And we'll talk about some of what those things are. And all I've seen is horrible messes. And back in my day, we used to have a little joke that said, if you want to make sure a document is never found again, by all means, post it to SharePoint. So maybe it was a data destruction application masquerading as collaboration application. Again, the free aspect to Teams, interesting. Obviously, in response to the free offerings from various other vendors, Google Meetups, Hangouts, and then something called Chimes that Amazon had, which was, if you ever want a more worse collaboration experience, by all means, Amazon Chimes, give it a shot. I do want to suggest that, many of these applications work both on the phone, in my particular case, an iPhone platform. And I would almost say, and we'll actually, talk a little bit about this, the integrations seem a lot smoother on the phone, especially under a few certain use cases that I'll be poking fun at or making fun of shortly. Yes, Teams does have chat and social media functions, but those chat and social media functions are, I think, really situational in terms of like, if you're interacting in Twitter DMs, if you're interacting on a more, I would say, social media platform like Discord and stuff like that, the whole ability to do GIFs and emojis is really, I think, an important thing for that type of interaction. But there are certain emojis that maybe might be inappropriate and could, depending on the conservative nature of your business, that you do have access to. Maybe I'm saying because of the potential double entendre of eggplants, for instance, and peaches, you may want to avoid those because Teams is really ideally suited for a business communications environment. And so I think there is sort of this innate danger zone of potentially using things in conversations that would be more comfortable in wider social media than, your on your Instagram account, for instance, than in business-to-business conversations. So fair enough. And then Microsoft's, we're going to take a quick look at some of Microsoft's greatest hits and greatest misses when it came to different collaboration and messaging applications over a long history. So strap in, valued viewers. We're going to have a bit of fun with this one, and we're going to look at a few of these particular use cases. So again, the first one, it's free. Well, it is, but, there are limitations and stuff like that. Now, what's hilarious is a little bit of who came up with these limitations, because the fact that for the paid version, the most basic paid version of the Microsoft 365 Business Basic package, at $5 per user per month based on an annual subscription, or £3.80 if you happen to use that currency, they allow you to have a 24-hour-long Teams meeting. Like that's somehow a good thing. I don't think anyone wants to be on a 24-hour Teams meeting at any point in their lives. Like, there are just certain features that maybe shouldn't exist at this point. Now, I get it if you have a incident or you are working an incident response internally, that there may be a requirement for that over in particular certain circumstances. But I'm just saying, like, this seems like not really a major plus bonus, if you know what I'm talking about there. That seems to really be any of the difference. There's no kind of security downgrade with the free version. Obviously, the free version is not integrated into the Microsoft Office 365 environment. However, the free version allows you to spawn the web versions of Word, PowerPoint, and Excel, which is kind of interesting if you're comfortable doing stuff in the web browser versions of these potential applications. So that in itself was a little bit strange to see. Okay, enough about the free part. Let's get into some technical stuff. Now, the big thing about its part of Microsoft 365 is it does benefit from all of the encryption work, from all of the data protection work that Office 365 offers. But we'll get into why that may not necessarily be the greatest thing ever. And it comes to do with this federation and your ability to share IMs and potentially integrate with other Office 365 clients. And this becomes deeply problematic if you're on a Teams chat and you have customers in that, and perhaps you make a disparaging remark or an off-color remark in the chat. It's highly possible and likely that will be displayed on your on those person's screen. This happens as a result of forgetting which chat session you're in, and there is no warning that there's potentially third parties in that chat. Now, there is the ability of the admin or the person setting up the meeting to disable those particular functions, but they are on by default. And so, again, what you're now asking to do is to prevent an embarrassing moment or a miscommunication from happening. You are now relying on the individual users that set up those particular meetings. This also comes into a big effect of the ability to record meetings, which on some circumstances are a really great thing, and others are a little bit questionable, especially if you're in negotiating clauses in terms of conditions as corporate counsel, or a salesperson potentially promising things that are maybe more aspirational than actually being delivered. There can be certain circumstances where those recordings may be used as evidence in terms of litigative activities. So I think it's really important to understand that there's that double-edged sword to recording. At least now, the meeting, proclaims that this meeting is being recorded, but we could record anything with our phones, depending on the state laws of whether or not you need two-party consent for recordings. So it gets complicated, and it gets complicated because of that Office 365 ability to invite somebody into your tenant, and we'll explore a little bit more about that kind of potential issue. The other thing that I find frustrating is when Teams is configured in such a way to not allow for that federation, or the organization is not an Office 365 tenant. This seems a bit deliberate, because when you get a Gmail invite with a Office Teams link, the link has to kind of be edited by hand, at least on the Mac platform in the ICS file, to actually get it to work. And so there are some environments where that Teams link doesn't necessarily work properly, and it can create some frustrating, especially in non-technical users. The other thing is that at least in the Mac platform, if you are logged into one Office 365 tenant and you create a meeting in a separate Office 365 tenant that you have, and neither are set, or one is set to refuse any sort of federation capabilities, you will get this error. It says only people with access to this organization can join its meetings. And the problem is, this is very similar to the problems with telling somebody that their SPF record or their DMARC record isn't working properly. You're now actually relying on them to fix your problem connecting to that particular meeting, and it can be completely frustrating. And when Mike and I started experimenting with this a little bit, it can lead to the situation of an orphaned meeting where a person is logged into Office 365 and they're seeing their pretty picture in the camera, and I am actually waiting for that person to arrive, but they're actually logged in and they're waiting for me to let them into the log meeting. So we were able to successfully kind of denial of service ourselves, deliberately, I will say, but again, for non-technical people, that would lead to a certain level of frustration as well. So this is where Teams and I have the biggest potential meltdown. So what I'm showing you right there on the screen is when somebody copy and pastes a document into Teams, you click on that document and it opens up on your Microsoft Word application on your local desktop, okay? This is now a separate document, and in many cases, when you hit save, you're saving a local copy of it, and you're not saving an actual copy that is in the collaboration cloud of SharePoint or OneDrive, okay? So you're with me so far. Now, even though I'm logged into the Teams application, and I go to our hub, we call it Sajac's Hub, where a bunch of our stuff is, and I click on a link to a particular document, in this case, the employee handbook. I am now, the web browser spawns, and I am now asked to log in to follow that document all the way to where its home is in our SharePoint environment, okay? So why is this a particular problem? What it forces people to do is actually push data, okay, onto endpoints, because SharePoint and Teams does this function. So if I post a link to a document that I'm working on and I put it into Teams, the other person on the other end needs to log in to Microsoft Office 365 through the browser, okay, and this is maybe just an Apple thing maybe. I'm not sure what your experiences are, but it then asks you for your credentials, even though you're logged into the right tenant in Teams. They do not pass the credentials across. So I find that incredibly frustrating. All right. So this is kind of an interesting thing that happened, and it spawned a whole great discussion between Mike and I around how we are protecting our organizations. All right. So here's the scenario where bad guys, hackers, were able to get access to Office 365 tenants, okay? And they would do this because of poor password hygiene, no multi-factor authentication, orphaned accounts, a whole bunch of different ways, or my personal favorite, old accounts that get MFA activated, but until somebody tries to log into them, they're not actually prompted for multi-factor authentication. They actually ask to set it up. So you're literally sitting there thinking you're protected with multi-factor authentication, but because that person has never logged in and activated it, when the hackers discover it, they log in and then poof, oh, they're asked to set up MFA, right? So this is another problem. So don't ever be in a situation where you have MFA activated, but it hasn't been assigned to an actual telephone number of one of your employees. It's a terrible idea, okay? But here's the interesting thing where these bad guys, according to this Avon company, had started dropping malicious executable files into Teams conversations. within the Office 365 environment. The Office 365 environment assumes that you're an authenticated user and just basically kind of allows you to do whatever the hell you want. So what we can do here is we can still allow executable uploads into the tenant. Now, this is a very strange thing that has occurred because this is what verbatim Microsoft 365 has put out there and said, we use a common virus detection engine for scanning files that users upload to SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Microsoft Teams. Okay, well, we've already shown that authentication isn't passed back and forth. What I think this is a translation of is Microsoft Defender is installed on your endpoint, so that's what's going to be your antivirus, your common virus detection engine, okay? And they claim this protection is included with all subscriptions that include SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Microsoft Teams. So I don't know what that is. They don't call it Windows Defender. It's certainly not the APT version. And the fact that we can upload unsigned binaries to Office 365 tenants in Teams or OneDrive or SharePoint does bring up some questions about what exactly that scanning is doing. Now, contrast that with an application like Dropbox, that if you upload something that has anything related to a malware signature with it, the only person allowed to download it is you, not anyone in your office and not anyone in a shared corporate Dropbox environment. So there is something going on in terms of the security there and a gap in the armor, because if the Office 365 tenant account is compromised, it seems like you can now laterally move within the organization by putting your malware into Teams conversations and tricking people into clicking on it. So, yeah, this is something that we took a look at, and I was like, yeah, that doesn't seem cool at all. All right, so now here's the big reveal of my discovery. In previous versions of Microsoft OneDrive, when you sent a link, you had far more options than you have right now displayed in you. You had the actual ability to expire the link. And I actually put this up on Twitter because this was a great feature if you want to temporarily give access to someone to a report that perhaps you are modifying or creating on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis, or what have you, and you want to make sure that they're accessing the right document within a certain time period. I can't find this feature on my new online OneDrive application. And I posed the question, and I've received no feedback. So somebody is deep into Microsoft and kind of understands why this feature went missing, one of which I thought was a pretty solid security solution. It lends me to believe that now any links to anything that you send external that the person has permission to view are permanent links. And that, to me, is something that we have to be aware of. Because that can lead to unauthorized information being disclosed to a third party quite easily if you've updated a document with some new information and this person from 3 or 4 months ago still has access to that document and that information wasn't for their eyes. So we need to be really, really careful now about sharing documents confidentially if we can't expire links. And this might be, and I know Ignite can do this, but other vendors and stuff like that are building sort of like SharePoint on steroids or something that's a lot more secure that has the audit trail ability. And interestingly enough, Office 365 tenants may or may not be able to have a forensics trail on who did what when, unless that's enabled and unless it's actually a higher level of subscription as well. So the fact that this feature has disappeared really does make me somewhat concerned about it. So I want to now talk a little bit about the whole ecosystem and why this has now become a little bit dangerous. So we all know that software can have vulnerabilities and that, one day you're secure and the next day you're not. Now, to Microsoft's credit, They keep their Office environment updated very, very aggressively. I mean, I get prompts to update my Microsoft applications through the OS. I know that the same can be said for the actual experience on the Windows desktop. But this was an attack a couple years back that leveraged a GIF, like the one that you're seeing now, to scrape users' data and ultimately snatch the authentication tokens that are used within the Office 365 tenant to be able to take over an entire organization's rosters of Teams accounts. So this was a direct attack on Teams using a GIF. Now, this was by no means an easy type of attack. And due to the complexity of it, I'm fairly certain this was like an APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Actor style of attack, because there were a number of steps that you needed to do in order to do this. So by no means was this trivial. And of course, it came back to the fact that you needed to get access to the Office 365 tenant client because of either a failure to implement MFA, poor password hygiene, or a compromised account. Okay, so you needed to get a foothold into the system, but you were then able to use Teams to laterally move and infect all the things. Now, this was as a result of some subterranean trickery where you were able to leverage the Teams environment to send those authentication tokens back to a subdomain that you had control of, which again, pretty technical type of attack, a lot of preparation, a lot of lab work would be required to get this working properly. So before we get bored of seeing it's all very bad over and over again, I think my point here is saying is that there are use cases within a collaboration application that once it is part of your company's DNA, it becomes a potential threat attack surface with potentially catastrophic results. And so this when I sort of attack these types of things, I love me my Dropbox. I know it. I've used it for years and years and years. I'm aware of the security features, et cetera, and I'm comfortable with Zoom. So there is I would say a compelling argument to look at a separate third-party collaboration application and a separate data sharing application. And that's why, I think some of our sponsors today have excellent products within that particular realm. And I am an 8x8 user, so I think they're great. Although I haven't used the meeting function yet, I'm still a Zoom guy, right? Here's where Microsoft is really kind of done us a service, I think a great service, but at the same time has opened up an attack surface that we may not even realize is there. So as an example, the integration between moving across two Office 365 tenants on my phone is a hell of a lot more solid than the one on the Apple Mac platform, and quite possibly in the Windows environment. Again, I don't know a lot about the Windows experience of quickly moving between Office 365 tenants, but I do know that you certainly have to enable a bunch of things at the admin level in order to add guests, for instance, into your Office 365 environment, and those require elevated privileges to do so. What I will point out, though, is since we are allowed to drop executables into the Microsoft Teams environment, and it works really well on your phone, this is a potential attack surface all of its own where you are able to get malware, Trojans, or a malicious application onto endpoints via Teams on the actual phone itself, because this actually links back to OneDrive. So again, and my phone is a lot less defended as the majority of folks' phones probably are, unless your company has mobile MDM or has leveraged Microsoft Intune to protect and secure your mobile applications. I don't necessarily see this as an attack surface. I don't know, and I did a bunch of research and kind of looked through all of our cyber threat intelligence stuff, and my conclusion here is we have a big blank area about malware on phones. We do hear the announcements where they found, a bunch of applications that have been downloaded tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of times that had malware in them. But I'm not aware of any cases where the actual Teams on your phone was leveraged to plant malware from a compromised Office 365 tenant yet. And I'm not saying it hasn't happened, I just haven't heard of it. But it seems to me a fairly trivial way of getting malware onto mobile endpoints with all the fun that ensues. And I think more, too, the other issue that I have here is that compromise of the Office 365 tenant can really open up a new attack surface of business email compromise, or maybe we don't call it email compromise anymore, business communication compromise, BCC, but that has a lot of different connotations, including blank carbon copy. But I guess what I'm saying here is that this can be used for like gift card scams pretty easily once that Office 365 chat is initiated with account takeover or malicious actor. Because we tend to trust the internal business communications of Teams more than we would, say, a Twitter DM or even a text message on our phones, right? Because Teams and, equal Office 365, I think there's a sense that we're more safe from malicious communications over Teams. But in fact, I feel like that could also be an attack surface where, face-to-face and video calling might be, the answer for those situations where you feel like you're being asked to do something that it's a bit weird, how it comes with a sense of urgency, and it's like really nothing you've ever done before. This is going to be a problem. For sure. And that sort of, is the team's observations and concerns around the chat and social media functions, because we have different personas depending on what platforms we're using. So Slack, Discord, Signal, WhatsApp, iMessenger, right? All of us kind of communicate in different ways to our spouses, to our loved ones, to our parental units, amongst our friends, amongst our, gaming group, whatever you want to call it. And, I found myself typing the wrong thing into the wrong chat. I found myself typing the wrong thing into the wrong chat application. Because it's maybe an emotional situation or something that's requiring an immediate response. So I think there needs to be a separation between church and state here. There needs to be a more trusted environment that doesn't actually have that federated capability of inviting somebody into your home and then forgetting that they're living there and sending out links to internal documents that don't expire or the access to them never expires. I think that's a huge problem in terms of like the compliance people in your company getting very uncomfortable with sort of Swiss cheesing some of the drives and SharePoint repositories that we have. And so my compelling argument here is that, yes, Teams is free, but it comes with a certain level of responsibility and user training and, for lack of a better word, discipline about how you're going to ensure that you have, a robust external social media policy, but some robust rules around data sharing. And this, sort of raises another fundamental question, if you will, about the history of sort of Microsoft and what it wanted to do. Microsoft has, over time, I think, evolved. From Yammer, which had the worst integration and required separate user IDs and passwords to use and wasn't a great experience. Skype for Business, which was more geared towards telecommunications. And I would say, to be honest, poorly executed telecommunications, unlike modern vendors that are using more of a modern stack when it came to it. I mean, let's face it, Skype for Business was essentially a derivative of the original Skype, which could arguably say was the first major voice over IP application presented to the world. And, with all of that sort of fraughts and perils and the fact that it seems to be frequently used in business email compromise and social engineering attacks. But then there was MSN Messenger. And really, when I talked to a bunch of friends about MSN Messenger, many of them point to AOL and MSN Messenger as being some of their best messaging experiences. And that I found really, really interesting. And, the interactions and those early days conversations that we had online, MSN was looked at as sort of like an evolution of ICQ, if you remember the ICQ platform. And so I think when I sort of chart this path, I understand what Microsoft's philosophy is about sort of like, one Office 365 tenant to rule all the things. But I think that when we look at where those attack surfaces lie within business today, there is a bit of an argument for segmentation between services. To actually know when you're external and know when you're internal and not blur those particular lines. So we're getting down to sort of the final challenge here where we're going to have some time left over for Q&A. But I want to go through a few of the things here that really is going to, that you need to focus on within the Teams environment, unless you decide you're just going to take my advice and go third-party application to fulfill those specific business requirements that you have, and maybe even simplify your life a little bit. So there's these two things around the notes and the cautions that are actually within the Microsoft Teams security best practices document available from Microsoft. Note that the federated relationship is on by default, and so that's why it becomes that particular danger. Because it's linked to your Office 365, which is linked to your email experiences and all of your other Microsoft experiences online, it's critical that you protect those creds and that you use multi-factor authentication. And no matter what tenant it is, be it Twitter DMs or LinkedIn messages or what have you, we need to set the expectation with our users that even though our Teams tenant is secured, it is possible that business email compromise and social engineering attacks could be conducted over it if somebody important within the organization loses their credentials. Okay, so again, we should be training our users not to assume privacy and security, but be vigilant that even if it's the most secure and internal communication in a very small group, that still could be compromised. We need to build resiliency within our organization to expect hostile links and files delivered via SharePoint link, delivered via a link to third-party website within your tenant that somebody drops, or even an uploaded executable or document that has VB code in it that could spawn invoke PowerShell and infect all your things. We need to make sure that we're using all of the Microsoft Stack security capabilities and have a covered and isolate and secure that critical information. And again, when we look at collaboration apps in general, we need to understand that they can only work properly if they are on a non-compromised endpoint. As soon as the endpoint is compromised, everything that it links to can potentially be compromised. Unless, of course, you've decided on segmentation by application and you're not allowing users to use the same set of credentials within a third-party application for a specific business function. This might also be an interesting argument, and I can see it both ways on this, but the idea that your organization has been hit by a ransomware attack, that accounts have been compromised, including Teams, you need to have some sort of backup communication plan in the event that your Office 365 tenant becomes completely unavailable due to a cyber attack. So there is an argument that diversification and a third-party application to handle business-critical communications even if it's just a Jabber server that you stood up yourself and then you have as part of your emergency plan, press this button and, all of the Jabber tenants come online and are able to communicate your incident response plan. But again, if your IR plan isn't printed out, it's sitting on SharePoint, and your Office 365 tenants are compromised, you don't have an IR plan. It's a single point of failure. Now, the way this thing is all driven, and this is a big one, and this is sort of something that Mike and I talked about in depth, is that Office 365 Teams governance policies are the most reliable way to enforce security across all of Office 365. The problem is Office 365 is the big kahuna. It is literally everything there. So, interestingly enough, Microsoft, and I didn't even know this before I started doing the investigation work here, there is a Microsoft 365 certified Teams Administrator Associate. There's also one for the email platform itself as well, and then the overall platform, including applications and different settings within those applications to make them secure. You need somebody that can look at this and has a laboratory where they can test this stuff to figure out how to deal with all of these different use cases that might be thrown at you. Because if we've proved already that your Outlook email, it has the ability to prevent you from executing .exe files when they're emailed to you, why doesn't that protection exist within Microsoft Teams as well? So in a sense, sending executables by email, the well-known attack surface for years and years and years in terms of like compromising an organization, but a same thing that can deliver the same payload isn't nearly as secured as your Outlook, as your email system is. So again, when you think about like what is the easiest way to get to the crown jewels of your company, or how to land ransomware into your company, it may be through, not the front portcullis of your castle and your moat, but it might be through a back door that you were unaware is insecured. And then again, there's the docs from Microsoft there about the M365 Teams Administrator Associate. I included that link. Super important you look at it and you get somebody on your team that can configure this properly, appropriate to your threat models. And I mean, this is not a threat model lecture by any means or stretch, but I'm just saying you need to know the most likely avenues of attack and what those people would be after, okay? Cool. Now, this attack happened, and there was this whole series of unfortunate events, some of which are somewhat opaque in terms of we don't exactly know what happened, but we do know that part of the whole Microsoft Office ecosystem authentication mechanism is done through Active Directory, which creates token signing certificates, which essentially allow for your access or denial to various Microsoft services across the Azure Office 365 environment. Okay. Now, there are some default settings that just kind of baffle the mind. So the first is the default setting of a certificate of the golden ticket, which is a complex cyber attack that we're going to talk about in a moment. But it's valid for a year and will allow an attacker to log into Azure Office 365 as any user within AD, regardless of any password resets or MFA. Okay, so once that ticket is generated, it is not regenerated if there is a change in MFA or the password. I think this has been fixed, okay? But again, this comes down to, and it wasn't widely publicized, but this comes down to your vulnerability management in your Office infrastructure. And so if the on-premise AD file server is tampered with and the Kerberos authentication ticket service is compromised, you can expect bad guys to be logging in, as they did in a very famous supply chain attack, which still to this day we don't have as many details as we really need to understand it. Okay, so we know that SolarWinds Orion was was compromised, and that allowed Russians and potentially Chinese to attack the U.S. Department of Justice, okay? Mimkatz was used on an endpoint to allow access, elevated access credentials into Office 365, where the environment of the Department of Justice was compromised. Mimkatz was used to find something that with elevated privileges to allow for the attack on the Kerberos authentication ticket generating service, which then allowed access to the Office 365 tenant of many district attorneys, which in turn ended up compromising the PACER application, or the public access to courts electronic records, which could, depending on the level of privilege that the district attorney had, lead to a compromise of things like search warrants, grand jury findings, which are all supposed to be what they call either in a redacted form if they're ever made public, or if they are if access is denied to them within the PACER environment, and may not be denied to users of a particular level of privilege, such as the United States District Attorney's accounts that were compromised. So as we can see, with a bunch of tools, we were able to get at some very, very sensitive data through a series of different technology, I would call, failures. Now, you see one app on here that to this day its role is unknown in the SolarWinds hijacking, and that is an app called Team City that is similar to a Confluence type of application involved in the build process for the SolarWinds Orion product. So there is still a big circle around what role that played in the overall compromise and the series and chain of attacks that were unleashed as a result of that on-premise domain server compromised account that then led to the issue of that golden ticket that allowed access into that Office 365 tenant. So really a fascinating study in terms of the series of attacks that can take place by obviously an advanced persistent threat actor. So is Office 365 still under attack right at this very moment? According to Mandiant, it certainly is. And according to the rest of us in the wider group, there is a constant attack going on by Mandiant, targeted attack on Office 365, including the attempts to gain unrestricted access to those particular tenants. So Office 365 in general is an ongoing target for your organization, and that's why going back to those administrator accounts that we talked about, and the security courses that Microsoft offers on securing the Azure tenant, which in terms, secures all of your Office 365 stuff, it's absolutely critical. And finally, a little bit of things about Microsoft has made a incredibly complex environment, which has tremendous business value. But in the words of Mike Thompson, who is sort of my wingman for this, and thanks, Mike, for all of your help on this, if you're running a well-populated M365 tenant, it absolutely needs people and or skills. It can't be a hobby. If you mess it up, your organization is messed up. And of course, Mike, being from Manchester, had to redact the actual words that he used. So with that, let's get into the tough part of this show, which is your questions, and maybe I have a few answers or advice for you.
Okay, great stuff, Ian. We do have some questions, and I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next presentation, so send them on in. So let's go right to the Q&A box, see what we have. The first one, not a question, but it's an observation from your buddy Mike at the Bear Farmers. Maybe you want to comment. Mike says, the security tooling in Microsoft 365 is very granular, but it is there and powerful. We need people on the payroll to manage it. This isn't a hobby. And he was talking, when you were talking about the importance of appointing a Teams administrator. What do you have to say about that, Ian?
So one of the biggest weaknesses in organizations is the onboarding and offboarding process, right? When we even talk about zero trust, we talk about how the only source of truth should be who's on your payroll or who's not on your payroll, and that should kick off a bunch of automated and orchestration, right? So this is now a critical part of your organization. And it's also, there's a cost recovery access to this as well, because if you have a whole bunch of Office 365 licenses that are basically not allocated or not filled, or worse, allocated to people that are no longer working with your organization, you're literally just burning money. So Mike is right in that the configuration and organization of your SharePoint, of your Office 365, of your Teams environment, and all the other things that are critical to making whatever you make or providing the services that you provide has to be the focus of an organization, especially if you've gone into the effort of moving your organization into that Office 365 world. You have to know what you're doing.
Okay, great. Here's another observation from Jason in the audience. He says, one of the default options in Teams is allowing outside people to send you a chat message if they have your email address. No different than someone emailing you when they have your email address. But seeing it show up in Teams chat is a bit more jarring and possibly exploitable. What do you have to say about that, Ian?
Highly exploitable is what I would say about that. Yeah, man, like the fact that federated ability is on by default really does mean people can, come in. It's sort of like the difference between, and this is the psychological part of it, right? It's like to send an email, it sort of has to go through the front door of your house, right? Chat in Teams is sort of more like they're sitting in the living room next to you, and it's a bit jarring. Like, well, how the hell did you get in here, right? People don't understand that function, and if it is a malicious actor, or worse, a supply chain partner that you have a great relationship, but they get compromised, that's the way they could laterally move into your organization, right? And so I think this is a bit of a cautionary tale. So you got to really kind of manage to keep the outside outside and the inside inside.
Okay. There's a question from Michael in the audience. If you have on-premise SharePoint and Office 365 Teams, documents are technically stored in the MS Cloud, correct?
So if they're posted into the Teams environment, yes, they go up into the Microsoft Cloud, which has some serious geopolitical problems and issues, especially if you were dealing with, for instance, European information, customers, sensitive information, and or personal data. Yeah, you are actually making a copy of that document. And furthermore, if there are links internally to that document and the permissions aren't shared up properly on your on-premise, those links could be exploited and followed as well. Even though you thought you had a document that you were sharing, those links might be able to allow an attacker to come back into your environment and pull additional information out. This is why I made a big deal about the fact that you're no longer, at least on the Apple platform, able to expire SharePoint links. I think that's a huge danger, and it becomes amplified, especially if the original documents are sensitive and shouldn't be in the Microsoft tenant.
Okay, great. We have time for one more question. This comes from Richard in the audience. He says, for those of us working in a Microsoft ecosystem, that's not you, man, Teams integration is functional and useful. Do you recommend a separate platform for external partner meetings? This could alleviate the external access threats.
So I'm going to go out here and says it really depends on your threat model. Like, if you have additional concerns about sensitivity of information going back and forth, then I would certainly recommend that. But if, you feel that your threat model doesn't really include someone that's going to be conducting sophisticated cyber attacks that are really going to, go kind of try and cut into your organization like Swiss cheese, you might be able to get away with it. The problem, I think, here is that Microsoft has made Teams as, quote, free, depending on the way you subscribe to Microsoft, right? And so there's this tendency for the accounting department to look and say, well, why do you need a separate, account to do third-party collaboration? Why can't you just use our Teams? You're going to have to, in a way, explain that very thing that I did with the analogy of coming through the front door of your place where you have to sign in and we've got CCTV cameras to being in the living room already, right? And so I think you're going to have to really make the argument and say, listen, we often have potentially sensitive data that we're dealing with within our Office 365 tenant, and the chats are not ephemeral, and the links that I potentially would send out, I have no control over them. You're going to have to build the business case to get them to sign off on it. Now, the good news is in a lot of cases, those third-party collaboration apps are not really a giant expense. They don't inhibit your ability to get a third-party app and maybe even have it underneath your own personal threshold of account. But at some point, it needs to be sort of managed access again. There are plenty of stories of how people have gone out, bought, their own subscription, and then that subscription has remained on a corporate credit card long after they have departed the organization. And so there's an ongoing monthly expense or something. Nobody even knows the user ID and password to log in. I'll raise my hand and say that happened to me. So yeah, there is sort of all of this, the difference between here's a technical solution to the problem, but here's how we're actually going to use it in practice. And I think that's where, anybody can sort of download Teams and kind of using it and send out meeting invites. And if they happen to be in Office 365, they're federated, and then they discover they can individually chat with people. It's sort of like this genie that gets out of the bottle, and the genie could be pretty hostile.
Okay. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Ian, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Oh, you're welcome.
Everyone else?
It's always my pleasure.
Okay. Everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Expert Microsoft Teams Security Best Practices. So take a break. This would be a good time to check out those resources on your console provided by CoreView and 8x8, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to our second session. Gladys, please take it away.
Thanks, and welcome back, everyone. Thanks for sticking for our second session of the day. And thanks, of course, to our sponsors, CoreView and 8x8, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director, and I am moderating the second session of our Microsoft Teams Security Best Practices Summit. This session is called Expert Microsoft Teams Security Best Practices. Our speaker for this session is Ben Stejink. He's the owner and chief cloud consultant at Intelligent. Ben's expertise is on the Microsoft Intelligent Cloud, especially Microsoft 365 and Azure. He has over 15 years of experience with SharePoint, over 9 years of experience with Microsoft 365, and he's a Microsoft certified trainer. Ben also co-hosts the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast, where he discusses the latest technologies in the Microsoft 365 and Azure space from the point of view of an IT pro. Ben, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Gladys. And thank you, everybody, for having me. Excited to come back and talk more about Microsoft 365, about security and Teams. It is definitely an interesting topic, and I'm sure you heard with some of the last session too, just all the different things there are to think about when it comes to securing your Microsoft 365 environment, securing Teams, the various content and collaboration that can actually happen in Teams. If you do want to connect with me, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. Google my name, Ben Stejink. As far as I have ever been able to find, I am the only Ben Stejink in existence. So Googling my name, I own like the entire whole front page of whatever search engine you may want to use looking me up. So diving into our topic today and what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a few of my favorite things when it comes to securing Microsoft Teams. This is in no particular order. I will say as you get into certain aspects of security, different licensing may apply. I will try to hit on some of the licensing high points as we go where relevant, but just be aware that there are licensing implications that come into some of these different features. It's also not an all-inclusive list of what you should secure. I kind of thought through what are my favorites, what do I see a lot of people implementing, what do I think are important things to think about when it comes to various ways to secure Microsoft Teams. So this is the list of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about sensitivity labels within Microsoft Teams, conditional access, the whole private, public, shared aspect of Microsoft Teams, guest abilities when it comes to inviting external users into your Teams environment. Some of what you can do when it comes to Microsoft Teams policy, and making sure you understand kind of what's going on there, how you can apply those, securing data within Microsoft Teams, whether that's chat messages or files that are shared through Microsoft Teams that actually live over in SharePoint. And then I do kind of wrap up with, here's some other features that maybe we don't have a bunch of time to dive into, but I would go look at and investigate as I look into securing a Microsoft Teams environment. As we go, feel free to post questions in the chat. I am going to do my very best to leave some time at the end to answer some of those questions or answer as many of them as we can. So diving into sensitivity labels in Purview. These used to be in the Compliance Center within Microsoft 365 that has now been renamed to Purview, if you may have seen. This is one that, to be honest, I don't see a lot of people implementing yet, but I think it's one that every company should go in and take a look at. In sensitivity labels, in the past, and when they first were introduced into Microsoft 365, dealt primarily with content, labeling documents, or labeling emails, labeling pieces of data within your Microsoft 365 environment. Relatively recently, I would say within the last maybe 6 to 9 months or so, you now have the ability to actually set up sensitivity labels for Microsoft 365 groups, which translates down to Teams, and for SharePoint sites as a whole. And what this does is it helps you set up certain policies for how external user access might work within Microsoft Teams, as well as how sharing and conditional access might work. So in the past, when you may have gone in and created a team or created a group, if you don't have a sensitivity label configured, you would go in and maybe it would be up to you to choose. Do I want this to be a private team, or do I want this to be a public team within Microsoft Teams? Or some of your sharing settings were up to your SharePoint administrator to set up how are files that are shared in Teams through the files in Teams, which are just SharePoint files. How is external sharing configured when it comes to those files and external people, guest invites, anonymous links, that type of stuff. If you have sensitivity labels set up, when someone goes to create a team, you can require them to choose a sensitivity label. For instance, it may be a sensitivity label of an internal site, or a sensitivity label for a client site, or a demo site, projects, or maybe you go down the road of having these sensitivity labels be confidential, top secret, publicly available, whatever those labels might be. And within these policies now, in Purview, you can actually set up if a team is created with a sensitivity label of, we'll use classified, for example. It's a classified site. You can say if a classified team is created, we're going to force it to be a private team. We don't even give the user creating a team the ability to make it public. It's going to be private by default. Or maybe for a demo, you say this is going to be a public team. Anybody in my organization can see it. We'll talk a little bit about public and private here in a minute. But you can force those, or you can still leave it up to the user of this is how this particular team is classified, but we're going to allow them to choose whether they want public or private. And then you can also start defining these external sharing settings. That's the one that you can see on the screen here, where if I'm choosing a sensitivity label for my team of a classified, I am only going to let content be shared with people in your organization. You can dictate how that sharing works for those files that are stored in SharePoint associated with that team from that external sharing perspective. If anybody can get to it, if you're only going to allow existing guests to get to it, or again, if you're only going to allow people in your organization. So it takes some of that burden off of the administrators of making sure these different sites get configured properly, maybe people even requesting teams or creating teams themselves, they just choose an appropriate sensitivity label and the setting gets applied. And then the other one is conditional access. This one does depend on you having a license that includes conditional access, and we'll talk about that too in a minute. But being able to now say that if a site is labeled in a certain way, we're only going to allow web access to the content. We're not going to allow people to download content from this environment. We're not going to allow people to use the desktop versions of the Office applications because it does download a temporary version of that file to your computer. It's going to block the ability to use OneDrive Sync. And it's saying you can access all this content, but you're only going to be able to do it within the browser. Or maybe one that's a little bit more open. You can allow full access. You can use your desktop apps. You can sync. You can use mobile apps. Or if it has a certain sensitivity label, we're actually going to just outright block access to this site from unmanaged devices. And that's the key there. As you can see in that sentence, this is setting it for devices that you don't trust, the devices that are unmanaged within your environment. So again, using sensitivity labels to make sure this configuration is in place for the different teams and sites that you create, rather than having to go in and maybe do some of this after the fact or rely on users to know how to go properly secure their team or their SharePoint site. Again, for me, this is a great feature. I love sensitivity labels and being able to make sure that sites and teams get classified properly, and the policies that I want applied to help secure that content, both from unmanaged devices or from external users, is put in place properly at the time that's actually created. So moving on, we talked about public, private, and we now have shared channels and teams. This is another area to think about when it comes to securing Microsoft Teams, is understanding what exactly is public and what exactly is private. When it comes to teams, I mentioned it earlier, you have public and private teams. Public is simply anybody in my organization can go out and find this team and self-enroll themselves, add themselves to this public team. So you really do want to be careful if you're creating a bunch of public teams, going back to sensitivity labels, that you're not storing necessarily sensitive content in public teams. You want to go that private route. Private teams are just that. They are not discoverable. Microsoft used to give you the ability to make a private team at least discoverable, but you couldn't add yourself. You had to be invited, added by an admin. They have taken away that ability, as best I can tell. The PowerShell commandlets have been deprecated. All the UI aspects of it has been deprecated. So a private team is not discoverable. You cannot add yourself to it. It is private to the owners and members of that team. So really making sure that as you're going in and creating these various teams in your environment, you understand that difference between a public team and a private team. Channels, you have the three options now. You have private, you have public, and you also have shared channels. Understanding the differences here, and I put the differences for public, private, and shared in that second set of bullet points. Public channels, anyone can access that is a member of the team. So if it's a private team, by default, all of the channels, you're probably going to create them. They're public teams or public channels. Anybody that's a part of that team, whether it be public or private, can access a public channel in the team. If you go in and start creating private channels, you do need to be a member of the team to access a private channel. But everybody that's in the team does not have to be given access to the private channel. So really, private channels give you the ability to create a subset of users that can access a particular channel in a team. One example I have with my consulting, we create a public or a private team. We do a private team for each client. It has the general channel. That's where we collaborate. I then create an additional private channel for just admin stuff. Contracts, documents, statements of work, things that I don't necessarily want everybody working on the project to be able to see, but there are a subset, the administrators, people helping out with finance, with creating contracts, that need access to these documents. It allows me to put everything within a team, but have that private channel that users get access to. For both of these, if you do want to include an external users, if allowed, can be included in public and private channels. However, it is a guest invite. They show up as a guest user within your tenant. The final channel that you really need to understand is shared channels. These are an interesting one. Shared channels actually just establish a trust between two tenants. If shared channels are enabled, there's some Azure Active Directory settings you need to go enable to enable that B2B cross-tenant access. And the important part is here is they don't end up external users that you share a channel with don't end up as a guest user in your tenant. You actually end up with a little bit less control over that because of that. It's simply saying this guest user from this other tenant is allowed into the shared channel in my tenant. It shows up right within their Teams client as they're logged into their native account. This is great from a collaboration standpoint. You're not always having to do the Teams tenant switching from one tenant to another to access it. However, you do run into that. There is no guest account. You can't necessarily enforce MFA on a shared channel where it's shared with another user from another tenant because there's not that guest account to go in and enforce additional security requirements on. So as you think about securing Teams and securing all that data, really understanding and thinking through, when do I create these different types of teams, public or private? When do I create these different types of channels, the public, private, or shared? And then I did put on here, understanding that all your files are going into SharePoint sites, that they are tied to Microsoft 365 groups. That when it comes to securing these teams and channels, you're not just worried about team security, but really it does start rolling into SharePoint security as well. And making sure that, again, especially if you're not using sensitivity labels, that you're making sure your SharePoint site security is in place as well, and not just looking at it from that team's perspective. Conditional access. I feel like this is something that comes up in every single presentation I do. I was talking to another one of my clients yesterday. This is far and away my favorite feature when it comes to Microsoft 365 as a whole, as well as Microsoft Teams. This does require an Azure AD Premium license, so either P1 or P2. You do get slightly different features within conditional access based on P1 or P2. There's some nice things in P2. 90% of what most people are worried about are included with that Azure AD P1, maybe even 95%. Most of it's there. Conditional access allows you to go in and set up a plethora of rules about who is allowed to get to what content within my organization. The first thing it triggers off of is signals. Signals could be, who am I? What is my username? What group am I in? It's going to allow you to set conditional access on a user-by-user basis, as well as different properties about a user. Real-time risk is an example. Real-time risk is a P2, but Microsoft 365 can determine what is the risk level of this particular user. It could be location. What IP address am I coming from? As best as Microsoft can tell, what country am I coming from based on my IP address? Signal could be my device. Is this a managed device? Is it joined to my Azure Active Directory? Does it have a device ID? Or is it from a device manufacturer that we get all our devices from? They recently added into conditional access device filters. It used to just be, is it Azure AD joined, hybrid joined, Azure AD registered, unmanaged? You had like 3 or 4 options. Now it's setting up a whole query around device filters that lets you look at probably about 20 different properties of your devices. Like I mentioned, manufacturer, device IDs, Azure AD join status. You can look at custom attributes. I think there's, maybe 10, 12 different custom attributes if you're using those for devices. There are a whole bunch of device properties you can look at to know when you want to apply a conditional access policy or not. It can be applications. What application am I trying to access in the cloud? Am I trying to go to Azure? Am I trying to go to SharePoint? Am I using Teams? And what application am I coming from? Am I coming from the mobile client? Am I coming from a browser? Excuse me. Am I coming from my desktop applications? And being able to use those as a signal for conditional access policies. And then what am I going to do about this? I have this particular user coming in from an unmanaged device. using the desktop version of Office. Maybe I want to block that. This is an unmanaged device. It could be their home computer. It could be a friend's computer. It could be the computer at the local Best Buy, at the local Apple store, and they decided they were going to go edit a document while they were waiting for somebody to shop. I don't want those users coming into my Office 365 environment, signing in a desktop application that may remember credentials. I maybe don't even want them coming in from the browser. You can make that decision. Or is there something about this that's risky? This is not a normal location for this user to sign into. I want to go ahead and prompt for MFA. You know what? I'm going to let them in, but I want to make sure that this actually is who it appears to be, and this is a valid login. I'm going to force them to do an additional MFA authentication and make sure, again, that it's a valid user. And then are you going to enforce the policy or not? You can go in, you can turn these off, you can do a report-only mode. You can at least audit, monitor what these policies are doing, or you can go in and turn these on and start enforcing them. You can go set up multiple policies. Most of the time, you see 5, 10, 15 different policies for some of these different scenarios that you may encounter based on location, coming from an Office IP address or coming from those trusted IP addresses. So while you do have your environment, your content out in the cloud, going in and enabling these conditional access policies and setting these up gives you an added layer of control over what users are allowed to access, when they're allowed to log into your environment, what they're allowed to do. When we were back looking at the sensitivity labels, and we saw some of that conditional access about web-only access, that is taking advantage of this conditional access feature within Microsoft 365. You can do web-only access for SharePoint, for all your Office documents, for email, so you make sure that users can only log in using webmail. When they go download attachments, they can only save it to their OneDrive. They're not allowed to download it to the local machine. All of that can be put in place to really help lock down that environment. One question that has come up recently is a concern. People say, well, this takes effect, is where this takes effect in the process. This does take effect after they do a validation against their tenant. Reason being, Office 365 doesn't know who you are or what policies it should apply. It doesn't know what policies to apply until it knows who you are. So you go to Office 365, type in your username, type in your password, log in, and then it knows, oh, this user is trying to get to this tenant. These conditional access policies apply. So we're going to block their authentication after that, or block their authorization after that initial authentication. So there's one thing. This isn't like at the firewall level. This is not cutting off access before they log in. This is log in, evaluate these policies. Do you let them in or not? Next up, guest abilities in Teams. This was brought up a little bit in the last session. If I have guests that are invited in, or if I have external users, what are they allowed to do? By default, Microsoft does enable a lot of this stuff by default. When you stand up Teams, when you implement Teams, one of the things you want to go think through and put in place is, especially if you are going to allow guests in, invite some of those external users in, one, are you going to do it? Guest access allowed, yes or no? The next thing is calling. This is one that's turned on. Make private calls. So think of this scenario. You invite a guest in, a guest comes in and is working with a particular consultant, a particular member on your team. They're a part of your tenant now. They can go in and actually make private phone calls to other members of your team's environment. There is nothing by default that stops them from going into Teams and making a phone call to your CEO. Do you want those guests to be able to make private one-on-one phone calls within your Teams environment to other users in your tenant? Meetings is another one. Are you going to allow videos for guest users? Do you want guests to be able to do screen shares? Do you want guests to do Meet Now? Very similar to a team call. Do you want them to be able to click on Meet Now, start a meeting in your environment with somebody else in your tenant? And then all the messaging. Do you want guest users to be able to post GIFs, to be able to put memes in a conversation, really thinking through what types of guests am I allowing in? How much ability do I want them to have if they're in my Teams tenant? Or do I really want to lock down those guests to maybe just be able to chat? I don't want them to delete Teams messages. I don't want them to be able to edit Teams messages. Just think if you had a guest coming in and editing messages within Microsoft Teams as an external user, there could be certain implications there. So going through all of these different guest settings, and again, thinking through what should or shouldn't guests be able to do in my tenant. Teams policies kind of builds on top of that. Once you get into Teams, the first thing is guest policies. The next thing is Teams policies. There are a lot of different policies that you can go set in Microsoft Teams. From app permission policies, you have meeting policies, you have messaging policies, policy packages where you can bundle a bunch of these policies together into a single package. If you're doing voice, you have different calling policies. So thinking through all of these and starting with app permission policies. Apps in Teams, they're apps that you install on the sidebar. There may be tabs that you add. Some apps are internal apps, but other apps are third-party apps. I can just scroll down the list here. You get all kinds of ones, 360 Tours, 365 QA. One of the sponsors, 8x8, has a Teams policy. You have Acorn, LMS as an app. All these different third-party apps. There's 1,758 items that are in the apps within Microsoft 365 or within your Teams environment. Your permission policies of these apps are, by default, anybody can go in and just start adding apps. Some of these apps may prompt for additional access to different aspects of Microsoft 365. This is something you want to be careful of, is users just going in, installing apps, granting access to this app, to certain information in your Teams environment. You can use app permission policies to go in and set if you are going to allow all of the apps, if you're going to only allow certain apps and block others, if you're going to block apps, or if you're going to block specific apps and allow all the others. You probably don't want to block the 8x8 app. That one you definitely want to be able to install. But maybe by default, you do want to block third-party apps and actually have people go in and request, I need a particular app. Can we go in and add this app to our trusted apps? If you're in a super secure environment, maybe you want to block all of the apps. And you do have some functionality there as well around setting different policies for Microsoft apps, for third-party apps, and then for custom apps maybe you've created internally. So, again, by default, Microsoft does keep a lot of this open in terms of allowing all these apps by default and leaving it up to you to go in and set up different policies around how you want to handle apps within your environment. Meeting policies is another one. And I bring meeting policies up because of certain things that you can do within a meeting policy, or maybe certain ways you want meetings to behave. Meeting policies is going to go through and set up different things like recording and transcripts. Maybe you need to record meetings, or you don't want meetings to be recorded by default. Audio video settings. There is content sharing around participants being able to give or request control of another user's screen. And even within your meeting policies, you can break it down to external participants giving or requesting control. So do you want external users to be able to jump into a meeting, actually request control of the presenter's screen, the presenter's not paying attention, they click, grant an external user access to control their PC? There could be some security implications there of allowing that type of use of control for external participants. These can be scoped to particular users, to particular groups. So if there are some cases where that needs to be in effect, or certain users that policy needs to apply to, you can do that. Screen sharing mode is another one. Within your meeting policies, you can go in and actually force screen sharing mode to be single applications only, not the entire screen. This is another way you hear about information leaks, is somebody's in a meeting, they're sharing their screen, they were just wanting to do it quickly, they share their entire screen, a notification pops up from an email, from an internal message, divulging certain information to everybody on the meeting that shouldn't have been. Do you want to force your meeting sharing to only be a single application to help prevent against inadvertent sharing due to notifications popping up? You can also go in and set certain meeting policies for guests and other participants, whether or not you're going to let anonymous people join a meeting. When 2 or 3 years ago, you heard a lot from the Zoom perspective about people bombing Zoom meetings. They would just go start typing in random numbers. I think at that point in time, Zoom only had like 6-digit meeting IDs, so it was really easy to just find random meetings and drop in anonymously. With your meeting policies, you can actually block anonymous people from joining. You can prevent anonymous people from starting the meeting, so that if an anonymous user joins, they have to wait for someone in your organization who can present in meetings from a guest perspective. If you're going to automatically admit people into the meeting, or if you're only going to automatically admit people in your organization, but guests, you have to allow guests in. Meeting policies allow you to go in and fine-tune how those meetings are handled, both internally as well as with those participants and guests. In my environment, by default, I don't allow a meeting to start with just external users. I don't want a bunch of external users jumping on a meeting that I created before I'm able to get in there and start talking and meeting and sharing screens and doing whatever. I want to know who's joining my meetings, who's not. I want to make sure that I'm there to allow people into the meeting before the conversation starts. Meeting policies are another great one. And then finally, messaging policies is the other one that I wanted to call out, that I would say you should really go look at messaging policies. Again, this is a lot more around if you're going to allow users to delete sent messages or edit sent messages. Maybe you only want team owners to be able to delete sent messages. What you're going to allow, from URL previews to GIFs to memes, voice messages are allowed. You can remove users from group chats. This one, there's probably not as many security implications from messaging policies. This is primarily going to be just your internal users. But another one to go in and look at when it comes to securing teams. Data security. So a lot of what we talked about is how can users get in? How am I going to set up different security policies around accessing different things? What about securing that data in Teams? whether it's chat messages or files that are shared from SharePoint through Teams, there have been a lot of changes around Teams when it comes to DLP, data loss prevention in Teams. This is a new policy that has just popped up recently, is automatically configuring Teams DLP policies to protect those files shared in Teams messages. So in the past, a lot of DLP has been DLP on SharePoint, and then DLP on Teams has been chat messages, conversations. What am I going to allow to be shared in chat messages when it comes to DLP? This goes in now and turns on file protection. So it's a Teams DLP policy, but if someone goes into Teams and shares a file from SharePoint and says, go look at this file, go check this file out, or here's the file where we were referring to, you can turn on DLP policies so that you can make sure that those files are automatically included in your Teams DLP policies in terms of what external users should be able to access, what can be shared with them, all of that type of stuff. It's just a click. Go turn on automatic file protection. The other thing that you can do with DLP is you can turn on data loss prevention for your chat messages in Teams. You may not want users going into Teams and sharing Social Security numbers or sharing passwords. As you can see here, DLP for Teams is not just limited to things like PII or HIPAA. Just recently, Microsoft added 42 new sensitive information types, labels that they can auto-detect and use for DLP, they can use for sensitivity labels, all around credential sharing. Some of the things you can do with DLP, both in Teams and SharePoint Exchange elsewhere, is start looking for things like storage account keys for Azure storage accounts, SQL connection strings, IP addresses, Dropbox, personal access tokens. They have a bunch of different sensitive information types now, all revolving around credentials and connection strings, things that you would typically use to secure an environment that you're creating, that you're building applications in. So when it comes to DLP, it's not just maybe what you would typically think about in terms of bank accounts and Social Security numbers, but sensitive information that, if shared with the wrong people, could allow them to come in and compromise your application or compromise your website, get into your SQL databases, and manipulate the data there. DLP is, I feel like, an underrated feature, or even a feature it's another one of those that not a lot of people necessarily think of when they think of Microsoft 365 and think of to go in and explore when it comes to securing their environments. And again, we're focused on Teams here, so it's going to be those chat messages, those conversations, preventing that information from being shared either internally or being shared with guest users or external users in your environment. The DLP as a whole can go in and it can be applied to endpoint devices, to preventing sensitive information from being uploaded to USB drives, shared over Bluetooth. There are a whole bunch of settings across SharePoint, Exchange, devices, SQL databases, on-premises file shares, Teams, that you can go in and configure to really help secure that data that's in your Microsoft 365 environment and protect that data from being shared with people that it shouldn't be, external users, or even shared internally in an unsecure way. And then finally, jumping over to some of the other services that you might use to help strengthen that security posture even more. Auditing and audit alert policies. If you've never looked at these, if you've never gone and turned on the audit log in Purview, in the Compliance Center, go in and turn on the audit log. Auditing logs all kinds of things, from conversations happening to site collections being created to teams being created. And then if you want to, setting up alert policies on those. Every time a new team is created, or every time a new site collection is created, that gets triggered when you create a new team. Send an alert, notify someone that a new team was created within my environment. Really go in and explore that audit log. There's a lot of valuable information you can get out of it. And then if you go set up these alert policies for key events happening within Microsoft Teams that you want to know about, you can catch certain things as they're happening. These, once you turn them on and apply them, it can take a few hours to apply. Once these policies are applied, it is near real-time notification of those specific actions being taken that you get notified of it happening. Data lifecycle management is another one when it comes to Teams, and especially files in Teams, is don't keep data longer than you need it. You go into companies and they have files dating back 20 years, 25 years. If you need those files, great. But if you don't need those can become a risk to have content, have files that maybe contain information that aren't needed anymore. Going in and using data lifecycle management within Microsoft 365 as it applies to Teams files, where, one, you make sure that data is kept around for a certain amount of time. Compliance reasons, legal reasons, certain data needs to be kept for a certain period of time. But once that time has elapsed, if you don't need it, get rid of it so that old data doesn't become a security risk or a potential leak of data. Information barriers are another one that exist within Teams and Microsoft 365, where depending on your industry, there may be even certain laws or regulations where two departments aren't allowed to have their data shared with each other, or it can't be mingled together. Maybe you don't even want them chatting with each other in Teams. You can go set up information barriers within Microsoft Teams, within Microsoft 365, to put those barriers in place between your various users, between various departments, so that certain sensitive information isn't allowed to be shared between those two different departments or between those different users. Insider risk management is another one. Again, a lot of these are SharePoint. Insider risk management can really help with maybe a data exfiltration from SharePoint, someone downloading a whole bunch of content out of SharePoint. But when we talk about that, it applies just as much to Teams due to the fact that, like someone mentioned in one of the questions in the earlier session, was files shared in Teams are stored in SharePoint in Microsoft 365. So insider risk management, this is, I believe this one is an additional license as well. But insider risk management can help protect against those internal risks of upset users, of users that maybe they've been terminated, going in and trying to steal a bunch of data when they leave. And then another good one to go in and look at and take into consideration is sending all these logs to a SIM. It doesn't have to be Azure Sentinel. It could be any number of SIMs that are available out there. Azure Sentinel is Microsoft's cloud SIM, but that audit log that we mentioned, the first one, go ahead and hook this up to Azure Sentinel so that all of those different activities are logged to that SIM. And then you can start correlating them. It's not just Microsoft Teams events, but Azure Active Directory sign-ins. In order to get to Teams, you sign into Azure Active Directory. So you may want all of those Azure Active Directory sign-in logs to go into your SIM. Those can get added to Sentinel. Other Office 365 events. I think there's I think it's around 6 or 7 different connectors that you have from Azure Sentinel to various aspects of Microsoft Teams, of Microsoft 365, of Azure AD, to ingest all of those logs in there. So you can set up alerts for certain activities, certain suspicious activity, risky users. Within Azure Sentinel, within that SIM, again, take advantage of these connectors. Most modern SIMs have a native built-in connector to Office 365. Take that data from Office 365 into your SIM to help you prevent and detect malicious activity within your Microsoft Teams environment. So that hits a lot of my highlights for going in and securing Teams. Again, there's lots of other things you can do. Go in and look at all the different settings. There's a lot of times, sometimes even weekly, I just go look through the admin center. I go look through things like conditional access. I go look through the various policies within Microsoft Teams. Go look through the message center within your Microsoft 365 to look for changes. I feel like every time I go in the admin center, there's new things out there. And you want to go in and make sure you're taking advantage of those new features, that new functionality that gets added to secure Microsoft 365. So with that, I think we have a few questions out there. If anybody has any other questions, we have some time. Go ahead and ask away, and we can address some of these questions.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ben. We do have a couple of questions, a lot of them around conditional access and Teams. I think you may have foreseen that this is going to be a hot topic. So the first question from Justin: can a VPN obfuscate an IP address of a device and bypass the conditional access?
So depending on how you have your conditional access policy set up, VPN can absolutely obfuscate your IP address. In some cases, that would actually, I would say, if anything, it's going to be the flip side, where a VPN, by obfuscating an IP address, actually causes a conditional access policy to take effect. For instance, if you have a conditional access policy in place that only allows access to Office 365 from a trusted or from trusted locations, and those trusted locations are your home office. Anybody coming from any other IP address is going to get denied access to your Microsoft 365 environment. It's going to say, this IP address that is coming via VPN is not a trusted IP address, so we're not going to allow access. Another one of the conditional access policies that can get put in place is one of the things around a risky sign-in in conditional access is impossible travel, where a lot of times IP addresses, maybe not the exact GPS coordinates, but about where an IP address is coming from or which country it's coming from. A risky sign-in detects you signed in from the U.S., and then 5 minutes later you signed in from Spain, from Mexico, from some other country. Obviously, I can't travel from the U.S. over to Spain in the course of 5 minutes. That flags an impossible travel. Sometimes VPN will trigger that one. You connect from one IP address, you connect to VPN, and then you go log in from another IP address because of VPN, and it'll say, oh, well, wait a minute. Those two IP addresses are coming from locations that are too far apart. You could not have traveled from this location to that location in that amount of time, so we're going to block access. So truth be told, when I'm doing actual demos of conditional access, VPN can be very nice and actually triggering conditional access policies to take effect. So all that said, I would say, if anything, it usually triggers a conditional access policy to block access than being used to bypass conditional access.
Great. Another one here from John. He asks, if we require two-factor authentication for all access via the web, why would we also need conditional access other than for a stolen two-factor authentication device?
That's a good question. You require two-factor authentication for all access, meaning it doesn't matter. I go sit down at any computer, and it's going to prompt me for my second-factor authentication. Yes, two-factor authentication stolen could be one. The other one is, again, I would hope you would trust all your employees, but even employees not thinking through a choice they're making. The one I think of the most there for conditional access, even if you're enforcing two-factor authentication for everywhere, is setting up conditional access policies based on the device they're logging in from. If I go to my neighbor's house and work calls and says, hey, we need you to go look at this, can you look at this document? And I go log in on my neighbor's computer. Do you want me to be able to download or access information in Microsoft 365 from my neighbor's computer? I forget to sign out of my neighbor's computer, and all of a sudden my neighbor now has unlimited access under my credentials to the corporate environment. Or a user that, frankly, is trying to be malicious. They want to go download all of this information on their home computer. Maybe you don't have the same type of security controls even in place on a home computer that you do on your work computer. Think of a scenario where they leave their laptop at the office, they come home, need to get some work done, log into their home computer, decide they want to sync files down. Their home computer has been compromised, and now that home computer can be used because the security maybe wasn't as tight as your office computers. It can be used to access your corporate environment. So conditional access around devices, in which devices users are allowed to use to access Office 365 can be one. I've also done conditional access policies for revolving around shared terminals in an environment, medical environment, where maybe they have shared terminals and you don't want users, the user walks away from a computer, you don't want it to stay logged in as them. Or if they close the browser, a lot of times those Office 365 sessions can persist, even if the browser is closed and reopened. One nurse sits down at a computer, logs in, checks their email, closes the browser, walks away. Next nurse walks up. A patient walks up for some reason to a computer unattended. Walks in, uses the computer, opens up the browser, and they're logged in to this nurse's email. One of the conditional access policies is don't persist the browser session. Once the browser is closed, that session can't persist, so the next person that comes and opens up the browser isn't logged into the same isn't logged into Microsoft 365 as that previous user. So there's those different scenarios where even though you require two-factor authentication, certain compromises could happen due to persistent sessions, due to untrusted devices, or like you said, stolen two-factor authentication devices.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all the time we have for this session. Thanks for that great presentation, Ben, and for the really great questions, audience, on team security best practices. So,
not a problem.
Everyone,
thank you.